Well, Gordon Ryan is definitely giving everybody a bunch of spicy headlines, talking about how if USADA enters into grappling, specifically the UFC Fight Pass, it is going to absolutely ruin UFC Fight Pass.
Do you think if USADA steps into this world, it's going to change the game a lot for the grappling world?
I think that if USADA steps into like Fight Pass events, for example, it's going to ruin Fight Pass events. And the reason is that because if you're competing in a Fight Pass event, or if you're competing on Fight Pass Invitational and you're getting randomly tested, that means now that you're the only person in the sport who's getting tested, and a person who's competing on Flow Grappling, for example, or one championship isn't getting tested, or in other organizations, they aren't getting tested. And so that means you have to be competing natural for those specific events when everyone else in the sport can be on PEDs. And so that puts you at an extreme disadvantage for no reason, unless you're getting paid absorbent amounts of money to not, like if you're exclusive, then it makes sense because you wouldn't compete in the other events anyways.
Right.
But if you're not exclusive and you want to compete on a flow show, like if I have an event in July on a flow, or like late July on a flow show, on a Fight Pass show, and I'm being tested, and then I have an event on a flow show like the next weekend or 2 weeks later, like I'm competing natural on this one event, and then this other guy's been on an 8-week cycle for me that like 2 weeks later, like it makes a difference. So if USADA steps in, like to only, I mean, for ibjjf, it's a little bit easier because it's just, the day of the test, so you can beat the test pretty easy. But if you do the random testing, then it's a lot harder to beat. You need like a team of doctors to give you like, blockers and stuff like that. So it makes it a lot harder. But I think if USADA comes into just one organization, it's gonna pretty much crush that organization, and athletes will just not compete in that organization because there's no reason to. I mean, unless they're exclusive, there's no reason to, because that means they would have to compete in other organizations being natural, and they put themselves willingly at a disadvantage. So it doesn't really make sense for them to do that. If USADA comes in and tests everyone across the board, then it makes sense because everyone's being tested, but there's not one governing body in jiu-jitsu that controls everything. So in order for USADA to come into one championship, or WADA to come into one championship, into Flow, into Fight Pass, into all the organizations is pretty into ADCC, which will never be in ADCC. The ADCC has publicly said we're never testing. And so it doesn't really make sense for them to do that. I think you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot. If you bring USADA into like a Fight Pass Invitational, because people will just start not competing. And also, fans don't realize, like, it's like, oh, well, jiu-jitsu doesn't test and everyone's juiced up. Everyone in most sports, like 95% or more of pro athletes, are also juiced up. It's just they have testing, but like, you don't think the NFL guys with the traps coming up to their ears are like out of their minds? Like, are you kidding me? So it's just a joke. But I definitely think that, USADA coming in would have to be across the board rather than just one organization or another. And if USADA did come in and started testing across the board, I would love to actually compete against all of my opponents natural, because the only way that they survive for any amount of time is they just juice their way out of things for 10 minutes until they get tired. Like, if they didn't have the physicality, the match would be twice as easy. Like,
this is one thing for sure that Gordon Ryan isn't wrong. Gordon Ryan is not as talented as what he is because of just steroids. He's talented as what he is because of his jiu-jitsu. Before his alleged steroid use, he was still performing exceedingly well, and his jiu-jitsu was still an extremely high level. So if you do level the playing field, yeah, I do believe he would still perform extremely well.
Right.
It would just, like, the only reason that they can survive against me is because they're so physically strong. I have to tire them out first, and then I can submit them. Whereas if they were just natural, they would just get tired instantly because they don't have the physicality, and then I would just submit them immediately. So everyone's like, oh, man, Gordon's just on steroids, that's why he wins. Like, no. If everyone else is natural, it would be twice as bad because I'm far more technical, and the work rate is a lot higher for them. And because the physicality isn't there, they would just get tired faster. So this is just a big misconception that, like, idiot haters talk about and rationalize the reason why I beat everybody.
Another thing, too, I think you hit the nail on the head, in my opinion, Gordon. I think it needs to be uniformity. The sport is not to a point where everyone's signing with a promotion being exclusive. et cetera. But the other thing I think that would be a steep learning curve, especially for grapplers that haven't been submitted to USADA testing, is, everyone talks about steroids, but there are so many things that are labeled as performance enhancers that don't jump off the shelf as performance enhancers. There's plenty of things you can take from your local grocery store that will end up, costing you time and a suspension and a fine.
And that for sure is the biggest thing that is difficult. If you are signed to an exclusive deal to only compete with the UFC and you have USADA, you're just taking something over the counter that, doesn't look like it's steroids. It could be on their ban list, and their list, guys, is extremely long. I think it'd be a good step to start testing similar to like ibjjf. I think it would be a good start to have some form of testing, reduce the amount of things that are actually on the ban list to where you have things like, for example, like trin, EPO, testosterone levels being like extremely too high. Some of the big stuff like Ordeca, Anavar, some things that are over the counter that are pretty easy to see. Like, this isn't something you want in our sport, but things like overly elevated caffeine levels or some random compound off to the side. Like, yeah, those are things that are probably would for sure increase your performance, but at least it gets the big ticket items off of the, but at least it gets the big ticket, items out of our sport and starts to clean up jiu-jitsu in a way that actually makes sense.
Because they're on the USADA ban list. Like, when USADA first came in the UFC, there were a ton of people testing positive for things that they had no idea that they were even taking, because it was, in supplements and or just straight up a PED that they otherwise didn't know was a PED.
Yes, of course. And you need like a team of people to be able to monitor that for you. That's another thing that people don't talk about too. Like, when you talk about like the Olympics, for example, like USADA and WADA are like, multi-million-dollar companies. There's like, there's many millions of dollars going into, drug testing. But like, you have the country of Russia, the country of Germany, the country of America, like sponsoring doctors to beat tests to win the Olympics. Like, there's a lot more money in the research to beat drug tests than there is actual drug testing. So like, if USADA came into this sport, into jiu-jitsu, where no one has any money, and they said, okay, steroids are illegal now, and I wanted to cheat, I'm the only person in the sport that can actually afford to get a team of doctors to actually beat the test. So everybody else would be competing natural, and I could still be competing juiced up if I wanted to, because I can actually afford to have a team of doctors to beat the test. So this whole notion that like, oh, we need to bring USADA in, like, it just doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, there's not enough money in the sport to actually warrant USADA testing. Like, most athletes don't generate any revenue for the organizations they're competing for. So you're going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars through the entire year testing athletes, which aren't really going to bring in the revenue. Like, you're going to spend, like, the organizations are going to spend money on the athletes testing them. They're not going to make money with the athletes fighting. So it just financially doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense to have USADA come in, because the sport just isn't big enough yet. And if the sport does get big enough, it has to be uniform, where there's one governing body, or at least every organization agrees to bring in USADA or WADA to do testing. Like, you're a long way away from ever having the uniformity of USADA across the board.
This is the most honest dissertation I've heard from an athlete about USADA and the testing going on out of anyone. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. And, I think that, a lot of people point fingers, but it's like, well, my whole brand is built on authenticity and being real. And so, like, what would you rather? You would rather have the guy telling you to, like, eat your fruits and vegetables and, like, you can get just as jacked as him and he just lies about it? Or would you rather have, like, an athlete actually talk about what's going on in the sport and, like, exposing the fake phonies that are like, oh, yeah, like, not me, God, everything is God. And it's like, oh, yeah, well, you're fucking sauced out of your mind. And like, you're just telling people you have to train hard. Like, it just comes down to, like, being authentic and, like, not caring about, number one, what people think. And number two, like, you're competing in a sport, in any sport, steroids are running rampant. Like, you think that guys competing in jiu-jitsu for $1,000 a match are doing steroids, and the guys like in the NBA competing for like hundreds of millions of dollars are not juiced out of their mind. Like, you think like a guy like, I think guys like LeBron, who are like 40 years old, like 6'8", like 250 pounds shredded. Like, do you think those guys like aren't juiced out of their minds? Like, it's just, people just have no idea because they're not involved in that world.
Right.
But I think that, just being authentic and actually talking about shit that people don't want to talk about can go a long way. And being fake about it, I think, is the worst thing. Like, you have to, and all the time, like, people who are most against steroids are always the people who take steroids. Like, we have like people who like used to be on our team who are like talking shit about steroids or like claim they're natural. And it's like, bro, you've asked me for steroid advice. Like, I know you're not fucking natural. Like, it's just like, and they just like build a brand off this. And then they get caught like Liver King. Like, oh yeah, I'm just, lifetime natural, blah, blah, blah. And then it comes out like, oh, it's like, oh yeah, I actually was on steroids. It's always the guys who are talking about being natural and that, that's a claim to fame is being natural. Those are always like the heaviest users. That's just how it goes.
It's common towards the end is definitely true. Generally, people that are against it the most are on it. I think of, like, for example, Lance Armstrong. That is a very easy example of somebody that claimed to be clean, was tested anywhere and however way you can think of, and still claim it clean. But anyways, I want to hear you guys' opinions. What do you think about this? Because I'm wrestling in my head with the fact that, like, there are some really good points they brought up. USADA would make things really difficult and different. But I think there needs to be a step forward. There needs to be something. Like, if everybody does at least what IBJJF does and drug tests at the event, it does start to clean it up. Like, if you have a dirty, filthy room and you at least get everything off of the floor, your room is cleaner. It's not perfect, but it's cleaner. And I think ultimately that is something that levels the playing field for athletes that are not willing to take steroids for the ones that are willing to do whatever they need to do to their body, regardless of what it does to them long term. It starts to clean up the sport. Ultimately, that's what matters. But let me know what you guys think. Remember, I'm not your coach. I'm just your step coach. So take it for what it's worth. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. I gotta go coach kids at Pans.